I want to say a big welcome to Ibrahim Bashir, our guest for the day. This is a series of webinars that we run. It's called the ProdPad Product Expert Series. And what we essentially do is bring in as an amazing mix of experts who bring their insights, their experience. And it's always with this focus on the content, the learning, and the sharing. Before we kick off, I want to tell you a little bit about ProdPad. So this is actually a tool that's built by myself and one of mine, the product co-founders, actually, Simon. We were product managers ourselves, and we needed tools to do our own jobs. We needed something to keep track of the experiments we were running to try to hit our business objectives and to solve our customers' problems, and to keep tabs on all the ideas and feedback that made up our backlog. So building ProdPad gave us control and organization and transparency. And it wasn't long before we started sharing it with the other product people around us. And today it's used by thousands of teams around the world. So it's a free tool to try. And we even have this really cool sandbox mode that we've built, where it essentially has example product management data that you can see how it all fits together. We got lean roadmaps, OKRs, experiments, ideas, customer feedback, how it all fits together in this product management space. And our team is made up of product people, or is founded by product people. We've got a lot of product people on our team here to help you out. So start a trial today and then get in touch with us and let us know how it's working out. We'd love to get your feedback. I want to introduce you to Ibrahim Bashir. We first connected after an MTP con, and it was great to get a chance to connect with him there. Now, he calls himself a data monster on LinkedIn, which I love. I thought that was really great. Now, Ibrahim has been building and shipping software for over 20 years. He's currently at Amplitude, where he serves as the VP product for the core analytics offering. And before that, he's got a great career. He's scaled Box's platform ecosystem, Twitter's service infrastructure, and Amazon's Kindle business. So he has had a lot of experience building some of the most famous brands that we know in the B2B space. And in his past life, he studied computer science, taught algorithm courses, wrote radiology software, built e-commerce platforms, and served as a technology consultant. This is actually his second time coming on to our Product Experts series. So I want to give him a warm welcome, and here you all give a warm welcome to Ibrahim. Ibrahim, thanks so much for joining us here today. Thanks so much for coming on board.
Yeah, thank you, Janna, and thank you everybody for the warm welcome. Excited to be returning and talking about a completely different topic than last time.
Yeah, absolutely. So today you're going to be talking about building these multi-product strategies. Why don't I stop my screen share and you can get your presentation up and you can start telling us about what you're going to be talking about.
So the topic I want to talk about today is new product introduction in B2B software. And the reason I wanted to talk about this topic was I see a lot of companies, including companies I've worked at, thinking about when, why, and how to introduce a new product into the mix. And that sort of can be a very strategically taxing endeavor for a company. It also can sort of make or break your product. It has a lot of implications for your existing customer base, for the key metrics that you look at. And so I just think it's one of the more complex decisions a team sometimes has to make. And I've learned a lot about this area and wanted to share it with you all and honestly get some great inputs and questions from you as I refine my own thinking. So I'll jump right into it. To start with, I think a lot of times when you're building products, whether you have an existing product or you're doing something 0 to 1, it helps to start with the KPIs and the North Star metrics and the operating objectives. And I've spent some time thinking about how these things connect and ladder up. And I wanted to share a framework that I've started using with all of you. And just to be clear, this is all framed in, I mean, you can apply some of these ideas to B2C, but I think in B2B, it's a little bit cleaner. So at a high level, I think any kind of B2B software, whether it's productivity software, collaboration software, whether it's cloud-based SaaS or on-prem, fundamentally comes down to 3 things that you operate around. One is growth, right? The second is retention. And the third is margins. And if you're working in a product role or an operating role or a go-to-market role in a B2B product, you're going to come back to these top level KPIs as a recurring theme with your leadership team as a business outcome that you want to drive. And I like to lay these out because I think a lot of times many product teams sort of lose sight of the fact that ultimately these are the things you're trying to connect to. That said, it's really hard based on a product feature that you're building within a sprint or a quarter to show a direct correlation to growth, retention, or margins, right? These are long-lasting, hard to connect to, and hard to move type metrics, which is why I like to think about sort of the next layer under that as the altitude that a product team should ideally be thinking around as a North Star. So when you think about growth, there's usually two vectors that you're thinking about, either the user growth or revenue growth, depending on how close your product is to monetization. If you're thinking about retention, there's usually customer retention or revenue retention. And then the third, which is one of my favorites, if you work in a platform product space, by platform product, you have a role where your product serves internal stakeholders. A lot of times people forget, as a product team, you can influence margins through letting your team help price your product higher, or actually controlling service costs so that you can actually make better margins. So those are, if you had 6, 12-month goals, they would be around this altitude. Now, on a regular basis, a team is going to have way more specific goals. Would love folks in the chat to throw out sort of metrics in B2B software that they think about on a weekly, monthly, quarterly basis. And I'll reveal that slide in a second, but would love to hear in the chat what people tend to look at in their businesses and their products. Onboarding, conversion rate. Okay. Revenue, support question. That's a good one. NPS, active users. Yep. Always a good one. Any others? Churn. Ooh, yes. Churn. So I love to poll the audience when I show this slide. Oh, downtime. All right. We got a engineering focused person as well. The reason I like to poll people is I've spent a lot of time thinking about this, and I think everything can ladder up. Whenever I do this brainstorming, these are some of the things that come up, right? NPS, we heard, net dollar retention, effects, time to deploy, ARR, churn, we heard. I've seen monetizable accounts, time to value, cross-sell, customer satisfaction scores. And I think when you're a product team, it can get overwhelming at times to wrap your head around this. And some of these can be North Star metrics. Sometimes you have threshold metrics and tension metrics around these. And it can just be a lot of metrics to wrap your head around. And so what I like to do is actually think about, how do these things ladder up? Now, this might be oversimplification. Mileage may vary in your particular product and organization. But one of the things I like to do is, when I'm looking at a product that we have, whether I've inherited the metric or the KPI, or I'm building it brand new, I try to make sure, A, is it clear and definable? B, can I show correlation to a lever that we think we can move on a reasonable time horizon? And C, does it actually connect to a top level business outcome? And this helps you do a bunch of things. First is, you can just tell a story about the value of the product work you're doing. You can also figure out what things might be disconnected from your top level outcomes. You can then have debates about what's more important, right? I find that if you can organize your backlog and connect it in these ways, then you can have debates with your leadership team about, hey, over the next X months, is it more important for us to grow revenue or retain users, right? Is it more important for us to improve margins or increase the average contract value? And if your leadership team can and give you a stack ranking of strategic priorities, then you can distill this down into features and bets that you want to make in the product. I see a question that I would love to answer. Any difference what KPIs you look at depending on the product stage? Yeah, I would say some of these make more and more sense once you have customers, right? Revenue retention and customer retention are irrelevant when you don't have any customers. So I think if you're in the 0 to 1 mode, it's hyper focused on growth. I think as you get larger and larger, you want to retain a base. And then when you get into sort of more of an operating mode, margins become more interesting and a focus. And companies go through different life cycles. And companies that have a portfolio of products and a multi-product strategy will have different products focusing on different aspects of it, right? So you might have a core product where you're really focused on improving operating margins and retention, but you might have new product lines where you're hyper focused on growth. Curious, are they easily accessible to you as a PM, or are you leading on it? What are some specific product value to the customer, form of completed transactions? So I think you can have your business specific versions of these and your industry specific versions of these, whether you're in fintech, health tech, property tech, media, et cetera. There's going to be flavors of these, but I find that they usually ladder up to one of these. And a lot of questions about data maturity and how to connect it to business outcomes. Let's deal with that in the Q&A. So this is the metrics framework I want to use for the rest of the discussion. So I'm going to switch to another concept. And by the way, all these concepts will connect as we go through some specific examples. So just keep the B2B KPIs in mind. So the second thing I want to talk about is Flywheels. If you've studied other product courses or read any content online, you may have come across the idea of a flywheel. A flywheel is basically an attempt to explain your customer's journey in your product through a tight loop. So very simply, you have step A, B, and C that your customer is going through. And that's the core journey that you're trying to drive them through. I know that's a very abstract idea, so I want to actually go through some specific examples. And I picked some random companies that I figured some of you might have heard of. So if you think about GitHub's core loop is they want you to publish your code on their platform. They want you to collaborate around that code as a project, open source or private repo. And then they actually want you to manage pulls and branches and merges on their platform. And that loop continues again and again. And a successful GitHub user and customer sort of fits this core loop. And if somebody is not doing one of these things in GitHub, then they're probably not a sticky customer. A lot of times these flywheels are obvious once the company has found product market fit. But if you're early, you might be like, well, I haven't figured out my flywheel, and that's perfectly fine. A lot of this is hindsight story. But I'm going to give you a couple more examples. Oh, are flywheels relevant to products that don't have collaboration as a core feature? Let me think about that for a second. Yes, they are. I think ultimately the flywheel is just about getting your core user to their aha moment and doing it in a repeatable fashion so they get sticky. So it could conceivably be a very individual user-centric focused thing. If you guys read the ProdPad blog, I co-authored something with Janna a few weeks ago that was about team productivity being a critical thing that a lot of B2B SaaS products are driving. So in my opinion, these days, it's not just individual productivity, but team productivity is something that a lot of corporations are looking for. So even if your product is not inherently a collaboration product, if it's a SaaS product, it likely has a collaboration element, whether it's sharing, commenting, annotating, distributing. And the reason that's becoming the case is a lot of organizations operate in teams or cross-functional programs where the work actually has to enhance the execution of the team, right? And so I think collaboration just comes into the mix. And so you'll see that more and more in a lot of flywheels, or a lot of flywheels have a collaboration element. But let's look at another example. So I picked Datadog. If you guys are on an engineering team or have an engineering team that sort of monitors the health of your service, something like Datadog is probably part of your stack, what they tend to call an application monitoring service. What does Datadog do? They collect your data, could be metrics, logs, events. They simplify the monitoring of that data. And then when something goes awry, an outage, an issue, an incident, they help you troubleshoot it. And if you're a successful Datadog customer, you're sending them your data, you're using them for monitoring, and you use them for troubleshooting. I don't know Datadog's customer base, but I can guarantee you a customer who's not using Datadog, who's doing collection with Datadog, but not really doing any monitoring or not really doing any troubleshooting is unlikely to be sticky with them, right? So this is how I think about their core loop. And if you're wondering like, hey, how is he coming up with these loops? I'll give you an example of how I construct the loops just by reading publicly available literature on a company. But I'll walk you through one more example, which maybe is more common or well-known. A lot of you in product teams might have used Asana or a product like, which is inherently a collaboration tool for product teams. In Asana, the first thing you do is you map out your product development process. You use it to coordinate the work using their taxonomy, and then you're able to provide visibility to project teams, to stakeholders, to people who want status updates in Asana. Again, it's a flywheel that kind of feeds itself. The more of your process you map, the more of your workflow you can coordinate, the more visibility you can provide, right? So those are sort of three examples. I want to do a deep dive and actually show you how to maybe construct a flywheel for your product or maybe a product or a competitor that you want to analyze. And so I'm going to use an example that we'll come back to again and again in this webinar, which is Box, which is a company that I used to work for. Box is a enterprise cloud collaboration suite, not Drop, which is a very consumer-focused storage tool. So we'll walk through this example. The tagline for Box, if you just Google on their website, is cloud content management. It's basically about putting your content in the cloud and making it accessible to the right people at the right time with the right compliance mode. So it's very heavily used in the enterprise where data breaches or privacy controls or access controls are paramount. And if you think about the journey of Box, which I did, having worked there for 3 years, their original idea was we're just cloud storage, right? They were like, hey, why email yourself this file, put it in Box, and then you can access it when you need it. That was their original idea. That idea then evolved into, you don't really have much of a flywheel if people just store content and then come back to it maybe. You actually need people to use that content. So their first big use case was what they called enterprise file sync, which is, hey, rather than using this clunky SharePoint system, you can put it in Box and then you can access it from Box with teammates, partners, et cetera, down the road. The third iteration of their core idea was, hey, this might have some value for a consumer, but there's a lot of other companies doing storage and access in the cloud for consumer products, everything from Google Drive to Dropbox. But the enterprise doesn't have some of these capabilities, or they don't have it in a way that users find joy in using the product. So they really focused on consumerizing their product for the enterprise and penetrating the enterprise. And then the latest iteration of the company over the last few years has been, we don't want just people storing and accessing content when they need it. We actually want to intelligently bring that content to the workflows that require that content as and when needed, right? In an automated way, in an intelligent way, in a timely way, in a reliable way. So that's the journey of Box, and we'll deconstruct it. And I want to go back to the flywheel for a second. This is publicly available diagram. You can look up Box's investor relations site and you'll see this. And all of the companies that I shared earlier, Sana, Datadog, GitHub, you can find their architecture documents online and just see like how they think about their offering. And I'll get to my point in a second. So this is Box. They present themselves as like, hey, we help you collaborate on content, classify content, automate workflows, sign content that needs to be signed, publish, analyze, retain, extend, ingest. So this is all the things they think you can do around content. If you step back, they're saying there's really three key actions you want to do in Box. They want to get your content. They want to help you manage your content through policies and access controls. And then they want you to use your content and prevent misuse of your content. And you guys can guess where I'm going with this. That's their flywheel. Is get content, manage content, use content. Now, not all flywheels end up in 3 steps. I'm oversimplifying a lot of these products just for brevity's sake, but you can see through that exercise how for your core product or a product that you're looking at, you can actually spend some time and try to figure out what is the core loop here. And if you can't figure out a core loop, if you're like, hey, there's no sort of repeatable motion that I'm trying to get people to arrive at when they start and onboard and mature in my product, you might not have a flywheel. And that can be dangerous because you don't really have an aha moment, or you don't have a structured way of getting people to stickiness and adoption. So I'll switch gears yet again. And again, the KPIs and the flywheels will come back in a minute. The third concept I want to walk you all through is what we'll call S-curves. And an S-curve is basically a way to think about the maturity journey of a product or a business or a company over time. It tends to look like this, which is why it's called an S-curve. What does this actually mean? Well, it means when your product is first coming out and it's emerging as a 0 to 1 area, you're there and you're doing a lot of manual things to try to get people to adopt and use and try your product and discover your product. As you find product market fit, your product goes through this growth phase where all of a sudden you feel this pull in the market, right? Where discovery is easier, activation is easier, adoption is easier, retention is better. And then your product sort of gets into this mature phase where it's like the flywheel is running itself. And then last, products tend to plateau. They tend to age out and they get to a point where it's like, we have a stable user base, but we're not aggressively growing anymore for a variety of reasons. And this is a really important mental model when you think about your product or a competitor's product or just product strategy, and especially multi-product strategy, is you're going to hit a ceiling. And there's a lot of literature out there about these ceilings, when and how they happen, whether they are permanent or can be broken through, when and how to actually bust through them. But the thing I want you to keep in mind is you have to start planning for your ceiling well in advance. And you have to even have an opinion about what your ceiling might be, right? Sometimes people use the word asymptote if you're a math person like me. But basically the idea is knowing what powers your flywheel and knowing what slows down your flywheel, and if that becomes more and more reality. The simplest example I can give you is, let's use a service everybody knows, Amazon. The asymptote for Amazon's e-commerce business is shipping, the cost of shipping, the ability to actually deliver stuff to customers. If you think about the history of Amazon, everything they have done for 25 years is ultimately in mind with, we got to solve shipping. The invention of Prime was, we want to create a service where people don't think about the cost of shipping. I want to get X dollars in my cart so I can get free shipping, right? Add-on items so you don't think about the shipping. Building a last mile delivery service so you don't have to worry about the shipping logistics provider, actually giving people access to their shipping service so you can increase the inventory. But a lot of it comes down to when people buy things online, they don't want to deal with the, how does it get to me and how do I return it if I don't like it angle. And you can think about this for any business. What is the thing that is ultimately going to plateau your business? So if you think about a GitHub that I talked about earlier, their asymptote, and this can be years out in the future, is the number of developers in the world who want to collaborate. Right. And so if you think about it in that way, a lot of these developer product companies will invest in branding and training and coding boot camps because they want to generate more users for their service ultimately, right? If you think about something like a Datadog, the asymptote for a Datadog would be it's really hard for people to collect the data that needs to be monitored. So that's why you'll see Datadog actually will work with every type of technology and every type of vendor to make their metrics, logs, and events collectible, because they never want to be in a situation where somebody says, I want to troubleshoot this thing, but I can't do it in Datadog because I can't feed you that data. Or if you think about Asana, wants to make it really easy to map every kind of process that a product development team would have. That's why they have a very sophisticated model of how to look at tasks and portfolios and things like that. You would never want a product team to come to Asana and say, would love to use your tool, but the way I do product development is not mappable to your tool. So they want to be very flexible in how they allow mapping. So hopefully it's making sense to think about the asymptotes that you might run into. What does this actually mean in B2B products? So for those of you who are working in enterprise products, this is what it feels like when you start to hit that ceiling. Your pipeline starts to slow down. It feels like your market is shrinking. Your usage starts to plateau, new competitors start popping up, and the law of large numbers starts applying, which means your user base or your account base or your revenue base gets so big that even though you might be adding to it meaningfully, the denominator is so big, the growth rate goes from 30s to 20s to single teens to like flat. And so let's talk a little about going back to the KPI. These are really important when you think about the ceilings you're going to run into, because this is how you predict that you're running into it or realize that you've run into it. The levers that I mentioned earlier, these are the things that you're really trying to control. And so these are going to connect back to things that slow down when you're running into these ceilings. And again, it's really important that you understand and recognize how you ladder up to your ultimate business outcomes. The thing to keep in mind here is if you as a product team or a business only look at growth, retention, and margins at the top level, you're not going to realize you're hitting the ceiling until it's too late, because those metrics are super laggy and they take months, quarters, years to affect. I'm sure many of you have been on product teams where sometimes people will say, show me how this product affects revenue. And it's going to be multiple periods of time before I can show that correlation. The thing I can show you today is it affects active usage, which we believe drives user growth, which we believe ultimately will drive revenue down the road, right? And the reason I'm explaining that ladder is the ceiling will be obvious at the metrics that you're tracking on a more regular basis, the leading indicators. The ceiling will be less obvious when you're looking at the top level metrics. So in a way, a lot of times the PMs on the ground driving product delivery and looking at their sort of more active metrics will realize the ceiling is coming before leadership a lot of times, because they're only looking at top level KPIs. So what do you do if you're about to hit this ceiling? Well, there's really two ways to navigate through it. The first is it's not a real ceiling. We're just hitting an artificial plateau, and we need to rethink how we approach this thing and bust through it and really just elongate the S curve. The second is it's a true plateau. And the way you know it's a true plateau is maybe there's a lot of competitors, maybe the market gets really saturated, it just becomes a commoditized service, at which point you need to say, hey, I need to get into a different business. My business needs to be a collection of multiple products versus a single product. And there are two very different ways to tackle the same problem. You can think of the left as like innovating into the next act of your company. You can think of the right as bringing new products into your portfolio that are tangentially related and maybe capitalize on adjacencies, but are not the same product. So let's get into some specifics, and we'll use Box as an example again. And that's why I walked you through Box earlier. So I'm going to repeat some slides. So if you remember, Box's cloud content management, the original idea was storage. Then they got into enterprise file syncing. Then they brought a B2C flavor to the B2B software. And then lately, they're more driving the content journey in an intelligent and automated way. So this is the Flywheel Box, right? Get the content, manage the content, use the content. But if you think about the original thesis of Box, which was cloud storage, they didn't really have a flywheel. They were just getting content. And if you were somebody who didn't want to lose your content or occasionally wanted to access your content, you would use Box, but you weren't as a user doing any kind of sophisticated management that would be monetizable, and you didn't really have other people using the content. That's why they made this shift to, we want to do enterprise file syncing. That gave them a use case and an audience and a user who was like, I have something I want to manage with this, and I have reasons why I would use this content and reasons why I would prevent use of this content. And I think that's worth dollars, right? I can be an active user, I can be a paying customer, I can generate revenue for you. And so this was the flywheel for a while. But if you think of the example I just gave you, which is sometimes you hit a plateau and you need to figure out if it's an artificial plateau, a real hard ceiling, that's what Box ran into. Sorry, let me go back a slide, which is they saw that in the enterprise, it felt like they were plateauing. And I don't have the metrics from 10 years ago, but it probably felt like signups, usage, number of seats probably were starting to plateau. And they had an idea that if we made the product much more usable, if we capitalize on the trends in enterprise software where a lot of consumer flavor was coming into the mix, we could actually break through that ceiling. We could get more people and more of the enterprise to use the content that's already out there. How did they do that? A bunch of innovations that now seem obvious: collaboration capabilities, a mobile app, redesigning the UX so that it felt more familiar. And now this is pretty common practice in enterprise software. It feels more like consumer software versus the clunky stuff from 20 years ago. So this is an example of a Box basically saying, you know what, the ceiling is not real. I think I can drastically increase growth and usage and adoption. What about other geographies, markets? Yeah, I think what you're bringing up is what I'd call a tactic. So from a strategic point of view, you should figure out, hey, what is it that's plateauing? How do I know that? And what do I want to do about it? Then you can say, now what are the tactics I can take to break through? So we'll get into this in a minute, but going after something that's adjacent to you, whether it's a user, a workflow, or another geography, is definitely a strategy. If you think about I have a core product and I'm going to take it to other locations, let's call it the Uber strategy. I have an Uber service and now I just launch Uber in other markets. That's definitely an option. The thing to keep in mind there is, at least in my experience, the multi-geography strategy tends to put a lot of pressure on your product team and your services team. So every market has its own nuances in terms of how you launch, penetrate, and gain saturation. And so there's local regulations, compliance, legal issues, et cetera. And I think sometimes those are underestimated. So I would say two things to base it on my own personal experience. I managed the Kindle launches internationally. So we had a US product and then we actually went international. So there was a UK Kindle and then we went into Germany, France, the rest of Europe, and then Asia Pacific. I would say that the thing people underestimate is every new locale is like an entire new launch. And trying to do multiple at the same time can be troublesome. So a lot of times when I've seen people do, hey, we're going to go international strategy, they do multiple new markets at the same time and then get overwhelmed. So my advice would be, it's its own new beast. Enter each new market one at a time, create a playbook of all the moving parts and treat each of them as a new endeavor versus we can do 5 of these at the same time. Or if you're going to try to do 5 at the same time, know what you're getting into, staff it correctly, realize the product and the way you build, deploy, support, et cetera, has to be different, right? I can give you an example from Box. Core pattern tends to be you get a person in the enterprise using it. That content is desired by other people in the enterprise who are not Box users. You have accessible links. Those links lead to people signing up for Box. Then a Box sales representative will go to that enterprise and say, hey, you've got team X using it. Did you know teams Y and Z are also using this? And if you start paying for those seats, we'll make sure they get all the benefits of Box versus people just randomly sending content links, which can lead to other downstream effects that you don't want. So it's a very common loop. That completely breaks down in a market like Japan, where users go through partners on procuring software. And so there's a whole new channel that you have to go through. So that's just one of the many flavors on when you start to go international, is like the way your product is discovered, purchased, activated, deployed, supported might be completely different. So keep that in mind. I know that was a very long answer to the geography thing, but I'm very into that topic. What is leverage that Box has in content journeys with Microsoft dominating the enterprise and Notion Airtable dominating SMB? So 2 things. One is, I think Microsoft's strategy, by the way, this used to be my job for 3 years. Microsoft's strategy is very much one-stop shop, but Microsoft is not going to win the usability battle, or at least was not at the time. 2 is there's a vendor lock-in fee fear with Microsoft of, okay, now I'm all in on this vendor. What if they up their prices, et cetera? But really the third and biggest reason somebody would go with a Box plus a Slack plus a collection of what they would call a best of breed tools is they really want the ability to customize it and extend it in that best of breed stack versus saying good enough on a lot of dimensions, right? And so that's a lot of the reasons is user choice versus centralized budgets. And you can see this tension in enterprise software. Sometimes you'll have the best product losing out. Users want the best product, but IT or whoever the buyer is saying this is the cheapest product, or it's easier to administer or govern. And I think, I don't know what the future holds, but I think in enterprise software, you're going to continue to see this tension between users having a voice and wanting to make their own purchase decisions at a team and department level versus centralized administration and IT budget saying, hey, we're making one unified decision for the org. I mean, we've all been there where it's like, hey, we're going to use tool X. And people are like, I don't like tool X. I wish we would do tool Y. And I think 20 years ago, you had zero choice. And today, employees at the company can force a decision where they're like, we're not going to use this, right? Even from simple things like your video conferencing tool of like Zoom to Google Hangouts to WebEx. I think on the Notion Airtable point of view, that's a slightly different product that's much more focused on people bringing elements of no code, process mapping, and different kinds of artifacts. So I think Notion Airtable might actually be dealing with what used to happen in Excel. But I think with Box, there's certain content artifacts that exist in every kind of industry, from media to finance to whatever, that ultimately need to be governed and managed, which is slightly different than what Notion and Airtable are doing. So I'm going to keep going. So this was an example of, hey, Box is hitting a plateau. How do we break through? The latest idea they have, which is, hey, we're not just cloud storage and access, but we're workflow products and developer products and security products, is them saying simple storage has a plateau. You can break through that plateau for a while by like going from consumer to enterprise and expanding your market. You can make it a more consumer-oriented product in the enterprise and raise the ceiling. But eventually, everybody who wants a consumer flavored storage and collaboration product has chosen between Box, Google Drive, SharePoint, et cetera. What do you do now? You have to get into an adjacent business, something like workflow, developer products, et cetera, which is what Box is doing now. So the reason I'm sharing this with you is, as your company is thinking about new products and multiple products, they can be designed to serve the raising the ceiling model, and they can be designed to serve the stacking on new ceilings model as well. I want to keep running through. I know the question earlier about geographies is something I would bucket in the adjacencies category. Adjacencies are your friend when you're hitting a ceiling, because when you're hitting the ceiling, it's like, what do I do next? Well, you don't just start doing random things. You do things that are one level of complexity removed from what you already know how to do. So if you think about a product, and especially a B2B product, you have some sort of core workflow, which your flywheel tends to define. You have a core user and you have a core solution, which is some insight you had into the market, some differentiator that you've been leveraging and got a lot of mileage out of. But whatever your product is, and think about the examples like Asana, Datadog, GitHub, Box, or your own product or your competitor's product, there's always this adjacent workflow, adjacent user, and an adjacent solution. So let me give you an example. I can guarantee you a lot of your products have an adjacent workflow, which involves exporting a CSV file and then doing something else somewhere. So it's like they're in your product, they're doing something. And then at some point, it's like, okay, I've reached the limits of what I can do in this product. I'm going to export this as a CSV and I'm going to finish it off in Excel. Excel is undefeated as an adjacent workflow. And a lot of products come out of like, what are people doing in Excel? Let's bring that into our product, or let's build a new product around it. The person doing that might be an adjacent user, right? So you might say, hey, I use this tool all the time. I love it. And your adjacent user might say, this tool doesn't work for me. My mental model doesn't work this way. I'm going to do it elsewhere. Simplest example I can give you is I run into this all the time. I'll pick on something that I'm sure a lot of you have used, Salesforce. I don't know how many people are like, hey, just do this in Salesforce. And I'm like, I can't make heads or tails of Salesforce. I'll just export this list as a CSV file and then go deal with it in Excel, right? There, I'm the adjacent user versus a go-to-market team feels very familiar in Salesforce. Or there might be an adjacent solution. And the way you recognize an adjacent solution is it might be a partner, right? Or it might be an integration that you already have, which is you're like, so I bring them to this point and then they go into this other tool to finish it off. And that's really helping you think about the workflow really spans beyond your product. You've just chosen to solve it through multiple products, some of which you don't own, right? So those are sort of three dimensions of adjacencies that are important. And then I want to give you three tactics that you can help solve adjacency problems. The first is automation. What I mean by automation is in your product, there might be a set of steps people are doing, and then there's a manual step that finishes off the process. Automation is about stitching it together so there's one less thing for the user to do by themselves. You can also tackle it through unification, which is, hey, instead of using tool X and then jumping to tool Y, let's just unify that workflow so that it's happening in one place. And the third can be collaboration. Somebody asked about collaboration, and I think it's becoming a more and more common dimension of enterprise products. If you're working in any kind of team environment, a lot of times you can say, hey, I've got a core user, but they have other people in their pod or their cross-functional team. How do I get them to collaborate in the product? I know this is a very conversation, so let's actually go through some examples. And I just want to use all the companies we've been citing in this webinar. So if you think about Datadog, if you're pitching Datadog, your use case is, hey, I'm just going to help you troubleshoot errors, right? When they started, they only dealt with metrics. They went after adjacent workflows where they brought in logs for log monitoring and data mining. They brought in traces for troubleshooting like live applications. If you think about the adjacent users, they really bridged a workflow between DevOps and engineering. And the adjacent solutions they went after were they really unified data collection, irrespective of how you're doing it. It all gets collected through a unified way in Datadog. I have a concept which I call skipping steps. A lot of times when you're building a B2B product, you see a step that is like suboptimal, unautomated, super manual, or heavy on the user. And your product is really helping people skip a step. So if I were to say, hey, what is Datadog doing in terms of innovation or productivity for my organization? It's helping you skip all the stitching of data collection, the stitching of troubleshooting, et cetera. But let's run through a couple more examples. So GitHub's use case is distributed developer team collaboration, right? The two workflows that they merged were actually storing your code repository and managing the version control. They brought together these two key users, which was the person who was developing the code versus the person who was involved with maintaining version control, right? And the adjacent solutions that they brought into it were the tracking changes. The whole grid protocol makes tracking changes much easier. So what step did GitHub let you skip? GitHub let you skip this whole merge. If anybody was an engineer back in the day, pre-GitHub, pre a lot of the modern solutions, there'd be this whole like, hey, I have a branch, you have a branch, let's figure out how to merge these. That has now become much more automated with, we went through Box in detail. Originally, people were emailing themselves files, right? If you're an IT administrator in the enterprise, it's a nightmare for you that people are emailing themselves sensitive data. Email is not secure. They really brought together team and cross-team collaborators and internal and external stakeholders. So a big use case for Box is you have sensitive content in your enterprise. You need to collaborate with a partner, an integrator, an advertiser. How do you do that in a secure and compliant way, right? And then they actually improved it by giving people a shared view into the version history. But the step you're skipping is this email. So you have a partner, they're like, hey, I need you to sign this document. Before you'd say, let me email it to you. And it's no, let's not email. Email is trouble. Let's actually automate that. Let's make it access control. And then finally, before there was all this like herding of cats, pulling people into a meeting, getting status, and then sharing it out with your execs. If you use Asana, the people doing the work and the people reporting on the work now have one. You had all these adjacent solutions where people filling out spreadsheets and decks and having meetings that you don't have to do. And the thing it really helps you skip is the meeting. Right. And you can sort of walk through this for any kind of B2B product and come up with the core use case, if and how they tackled adjacencies for workflows, users, and solutions, and what step they ultimately skipped. What about non-functional options, optimized deployment models, partnership size? I'm not sure I follow the question. I guess, could you elaborate a little bit? Are you saying where a OEM ISV is the adjacent user, or that's the primary channel? Yes, in B2B, it's definitely important how fast you can implement a solution. I think what I've tried to focus on in this webinar is deconstructing a business into important KPI, deconstructing a product strategy into a flywheel, and then talking about how to know when and how your product is plateauing and how to break through that with some tactics around adjacencies. What you're highlighting, which is maybe a whole separate webinar, is what are the go-to-market strategies and plateaus, and what are the go-to-market tactics that can become saturated? There's a whole corollary to this, which is like, how do I complement this with the go-to-market motion? So you might have a core product that's maybe, I don't know, driven by product-led growth and a freemium model. And as you go more up market, which is an adjacency, you might need more services and support to actually get a deployment implemented. You might need a partner channel to actually get pipeline and get adoption. And so there's a whole set of go-to-market tactics and go-to-market considerations. As you shift products via adjacencies, there's go-to-market implications as well, but probably another 45-minute conversation. But I want to hit you all with some takeaways and then get into questions. So a couple of quick takeaways. First is, as a best practice, you should think about deconstructing your B2B product into the KPIs and the levers we talked about earlier. You should think about, do I have a complete flywheel, and what do I need to actually complete the flywheel to make sure I have a viable product? And third is actually think through and watch out for these S-curve ceilings that we talked about. But some of the anti-patterns that I've seen B2B products run into is When you start treating those top level KPIs as leading indicators, like, oh, this feature today is going to drive growth tomorrow, that's a loose correlation that you're driving. Or if you start thinking, I have the flywheel up and running, I'm set for life. No, they can deteriorate, competitors show up, your differentiators dissipate over time. It's never done. Right. And third, and again, a more of an advanced topic, is if you're trying to raise your existing ceiling and create new ceilings by doing new products as well, that can be tricky because you end up in these core versus new product investment debates. And it's really, you're sort of haven't made a strategic choice on how you want to grow your business, and you're trying to solve it at a tactical roadmap level, which is dangerous. So those are some of the high level takeaways, and happy to answer questions around those. Quick mention, and this will be available in an email and in a recording, but if you want to read more about product, Janna shared a link to a post that I wrote earlier, but there's tons of other content on the ProdPad blog. At the beginning of this, she mentioned how you can try out ProdPad in their sandbox demo environment. So take a look at that. And then there's more webinars from other great speakers and Janna's team as well online. If you want to hear from me, if you're not tired after an hour, I have a Substack that somebody mentioned earlier. It's a newsletter called Run the Business. I will share shorter form things on Twitter. And then I actually am teaching a course that goes deep into not only flywheels and metrics, but also covers some of the go-to-market multi-geography questions that came up, including how to change your team and your organization as you go multi-product. I teach it on a platform called ScholarSite. It's a live online cohort that is going to be coming up again in July. So you can sign up for the waitlist there. But let's jump to questions.
Hey, wonderful. Thanks so much for that presentation. And thanks for handling all the questions as they were going on in the fly as well. It was really informative, and I took a lot away. I took a bunch of notes, and I thought it was really useful. So there are some other questions in the Q&A section as well. Thanks so much for leaving your questions in there, everybody, as well. Let's jump into them as well. So Kieran asked, which KPIs would internal infrastructure improvements ladder up to?
Yeah, I love this. And I love the infrastructure platform questions, because I think that it kind of creates this artificial tension between product and engineering at times, because product will say, hey, this can drive revenue, this can drive growth. Engineering will say, this will improve the service. And you're like, well, we're trying to improve growth and retention. We're not worried about other things. That's why I shared very early on, margins is a third vector that product teams can influence. It's not engineering's problem. So the short answer to your question is all tech debt, all improvements, and this is the answer to Karen's KPI question as well, is if your service is more efficient, you can either make better margins because it costs you less to serve the customer, or it can make your engineering work more productive. It takes less engineers to build and maintain your service, therefore freeing up more headcount to work on new products, right? And so I know it's a harder to follow thing than this feature generates revenue X, but yes, all infrastructure improvements, tech debt, performance, reliability, cost, ultimately ladder up to margins, in my opinion. Anytime I see a team saying we need more headcount, I say, what have you killed? What have you simplified? What have you automated so that you don't need more headcount, right?
I love that. I love the clarity in that. And so that actually probably leads to this next question, or maybe we can tie this one in, because somebody asked right after that, where does tech debt and tech improvements fit into this picture? Would you say that's about the same place?
Yeah, it ultimately comes down to the productivity of your product and engineering team, which comes down to the specific metric would be OpEx, right?
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's something I've always said is it comes down to the company strategy as a whole as to how much they want to put into the maintenance of the company. They can put it all into new product builds, new feature builds, and constantly gunning for new users coming in the door. But ultimately, you need to be able to put something in there for maintenance of the software as well.
Yeah. And Mika has a great point in the chat, which is if you focus on infrastructure improvements, it actually reduces the support cost burden as well.
Exactly that. Yeah. Now, Peter had a question in here, and he actually dropped it in the chat, but we put it into the Q&A because it's quite a chunky one. So there's some context here. He said he's in the early days of a platform transformation, going from an API monolith and a bunch of discrete apps to more of an event-based architecture. So trying to use CSAT or S to track for leadership, and it has basically raised some eyebrows. Have you ever used such quantitative or leading indicators of success when early in a platform initiative?
Yeah, so I can give you a specific example. I was at Twitter, which I know is a kind of a tricky company these days, but I was at Twitter when they were going through a microservices transformation from a monolith application. And we had exactly this challenge, which is why are we doing this? I think you're on the right track, Peter, which is developer productivity is your North Star here. How you measure it, I think really depends on your exec team and how they buy into things and storytelling. I always tell people there is some way people become convinced in your organization. They could be very data driven. They could be very story driven, right? It could be very qualitative. Figure out how to tell that story and then make the metric about that. So I don't think NPS or CSAT is right or wrong. I think it can be really indicative of, does life suck less as an engineer now that we have these services? But I think there are other more tactical ways to show it. You can look at number of flaky tests, time to deploy going down, number of rollbacks going down, engineering hours spent on incidents, rollbacks, things like that. Those are some of the ways I've quantified it, but I think pseudo quantitative or qualitative metrics like NPS are also fine. You can also this is kind of unfair, but you probably have a few very senior engineers. You can pull them into a huddle and say, hey, these are some survey feedback from the most senior engineers saying, I find it much more pleasant to work here. I'm more willing to bring my engineering friends and refer them here, et cetera. So that one of those, whether it's a metric story, the NPS survey, or just the anecdotes, is going to resonate. And I would use that.
Good stuff. Thanks. What about this one from an anonymous attendee? In the example you used with Box, if the company tactic was to internationalize, is it better to have geographic product teams or a functional or feature teams?
So I'll give you sort of a non-answer. I think asking the question is half the battle. If your company says we're going to internationalize, go do it. You got to pause for a minute and say, hold on, who owns internationalization, and are we going to have an internationalized product team or not? If you don't even think to ask the question, you're in trouble. If you think it through and say, yes, we need a geo-specific product team or just a geo-specific go-to-market team, you've done the work there. I think asking the question is half the battle. The second half of the battle is correctly staffing it. Because sometimes what happens, and this happened to me at Amazon, was here's one person in this country who will help you out. And it's like that person can't do everything from translating your website to dealing with legal issues with customs. And so staffing it correctly is also a part of it.
Excellent. Not a non-answer at all. That was excellent. Thank you. And Janna asked, can you describe an example for how a business might try to both raise and stack ceilings?
Yeah, I'll use Amazon again because I think it is the best successful example of doing both. They were in the e-commerce business, right? Like Amazon.com was the business. And they kept raising the ceiling by saying we're online books to now online media to online everything. One of the biggest innovations was, I believe at this point, merchant sales on Amazon outpace Amazon sales on Amazon. So they enabled other people to list their products and sell them on Amazon. That is continually just raising the ceiling of the e-commerce business. But today, Amazon is not an e-commerce, but it is a conglomerate that includes like a digital content business, a hardware business, a physical retail business, a cloud computing business. Those are stacking ceilings. What does cloud computing have to do with e-commerce? Nothing other than they got some familiarity building those kinds of products for themselves, right? And so they're doing both. They're continually raising the ceiling in each of those businesses by innovating. But when you buy Amazon stock, you're buying into this stacked ceilings of cloud computing plus e-commerce, et cetera.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. They're definitely finding those adjacencies and pushing the boundaries on what they can do. And Carlos asked, what about experimentation in a multi-product strategy? Is there an argument to allow both core and new products to try to compete for best solving the next S-curve?
Maybe I'll reframe the question. I think if your core and new products are trying to solve the same problem, you don't really have a new product. You might have a feature that you've started calling a new product. I think experimentation is important when you're like, what is an optimal solution? When you're in delivery mode and you're like, which of these paths is the optimal solution? I think experimentation is a good tactic. When you're in discovery mode of like, do I even want to go down this path? I don't think you can experiment your way. I think you need to strategy, thesis, discover, and almost like validate your way into that. And so I think first is like, do I need a new product? Then when you've built a new product and you're like, I've identified a clear user, clear workflow, clear solution, it's like, what tactic am I going to use? But I would love, maybe you can ping me on LinkedIn, an example where a company is using a core and a new product to solve the same problem.
Excellent. Great answer. And that's all the time that we have for today. I want to say a huge thank you for getting involved, for being part of our Product Expert series today. And thank you everybody for all your questions. We had a chance to go through lots of insightful questions. And Ibrahim, you were wonderful for answering them both on the fly and after the fact as well. Thanks everybody. Take care. Until next time.